Now, let's talk about the business of power. Now, that's one conversation that's can't go away just yet. So many issues are coming up and so many dynamic ways for us to talk about this. And so joining me on the program now to talk about the business of power and revisiting some of those issues is Victor Ndukauba, who is the Deputy Managing Director, Afrinvest West Africa. Victor, good morning to you, and thank you for coming on the program.
Good morning, Harriet. Thank you for having me.
So, Afrinvest recently held a training series, a second of its kind, and focused on some of these issues, valuation, pricing, mechanism, and some other issues. So, what are the new thinkings that you came across during this training?
Thank you for having me again, Harriet. For Afrinvest, we are a key player in the advisory space for power. We advise several clients across the value chain, from the acquisition of the old PHN assets to acquisition of the NIPP brand new power turbines, as well as advising one or two companies who are looking to pioneer IPPs. We determined that it made sense to have some sort of training series for key players in the market, not just any person. The idea being, one, to review some of the activities of the last 3 years in terms of the evolution of the power sector, the divestment by government, the acquisition by private sector operators, how has the industry fared, and then also to take some of the learnings from that process. What were the things that were done properly? What things weren't done quite right? What do people need to take into account, as we progress towards trying to fix the problem? Because as you're obviously aware, we generation today, just over 4,000, even though we have installed capacity of between 10 and 12,000 megawatts. The shortfall is quite significant if you consider it on a per capita basis. So if we were to achieve the 20 to 30,000 megawatts that has been targeted, significant investment still has to come into generation. But given some of the bottlenecks that have arisen, the question then became, is there a new way to approach the sector? Given the persistent challenges that continue to ensue. One of the issues, that did come up is the issue of transmission. That's the one area of the value chain that remains in control of government. And we all know that government's finances are not necessarily fluid or robust at the moment. If we are to have, investment in transmission, for example, go lockstep with investments in generation, or the expected investment in the downstream space, which is the distribution, it's going to be a tall order. Is there a way for government to perhaps attract private capital into an asset that it continues to own? What model would be appropriate for such an investment to happen? Or would it make sense for the government in some way, shape or form to, as it were, hands off, perhaps administration, perhaps ownership, perhaps just control of the asset, in order to disaggregate what is essentially a unified system of distributing power.
But then, Victor, taking a look at those issues now, does it seem like there's a new model that can be introduced to take care of those issues?
So there are a number of solutions. I think typically
realistic solutions.
There are realistic solutions. I don't think there is a silver bullet. Ultimately, it's dependent on everyone in the value chain getting together and determining that we need to make this work. That's the first that's the first critical element that needs to happen. So rather than have as it were, maybe the gas producers, for example, huddle as an industry segment in order to fix their own issues, why don't you get together with generation, get together with distribution, and begin to think about the solutions holistically? Now, what that could suggest perhaps is an approach where would disaggregate transmission, like I said earlier. Now, how would that be effected, or how can that be realized? One way perhaps would be to do a geographic carve-up that aligns with the existing distribution networks, but then find a way to get private capital to come in and invest in new transmission infrastructure. If we were to do that, for example, it means that the cost of making those investments will be borne wholly by the private sector players in that space. However, all of this cannot be achieved if we don't come back to the issue of tariffs. What is the appropriate tariff to price power? For what class of consumers? How do you classify consumers? Is it possible to have something that seeks to achieve a bridge between a geographic cluster and having a tariff framework that works, because there's a uniformity or there's some sort of homogeneity of customers within a certain geographic cluster?
So that might now be achievable if the federal government goes ahead and takes that suggestion of having geographical clusters, for instance. So for areas where you use hydro,
Yes.
You might not be charged as much as those who probably will have to focus on solar. So if, for instance, I'm paying 1 naira per kilowatt that I consume because I use water, that's hydroelectricity now, for solar I might have to pay 55 kobo. But then, how uniform would that be, and how appropriate do you think it will be for businesses who want to make money, for instance? How would it be in such a way that they wouldn't feel cheated?
Okay, so I think the big albatross in the room typically is this desire to have some sort of uniformity of types across the country. I don't know that in a pure market environment that you're going to have to achieve uniformity of prices. You can't buy tomatoes the same price in Lagos as you would in Kano. So the closer you are to source, the cheaper it is, typically, under pure market economics. I think the same thing should go for power. If we are to expect to solve the problem with power, for example, and I said the tariff uniformity is one thing that perhaps may have to give way, and then we'll find that we'll probably have to cascade the development of power projects, starting from areas that are more endowed, in terms of numbers. So with the higher per capita income, able and willing to pay for power, and once those areas have been catered to, then you begin to go further upstream. I think what that then presupposes is that invariably, if we were to approach it from that perspective, then perhaps we need to also then rethink the whole idea of power investments. So on the generation side, do we begin to look at things like embedded or captive power, so that you have smaller power plants sitting right within the area where you need to distribute the power? The inefficiencies that arise from having to put that power onto a grid and send it over long distances, hundreds of kilometers, then can be eliminated. So that could then begin to provide a very scalable, short, quick win way to fixing the shortfall. But
then, Victor, you will agree that this also begins to bring up a challenge for those residents who live in around industrialized areas, like those, for instance, Ilukweju is an industrialized area here in Lagos, and then we've got a lot of residents, and the reason why most of them naturally gravitated to that area is because of the amount of light. So how do you now make it easy for, if you want to build the industries, for instance, and you're giving residents the same amount because they live in that particular area?
No, I think that's a misconception. To think that because you live within the same cluster or geographic catchment as an industrial zone does not necessarily mean that the tariffs that you would have to pay as a retail consumer is the same as that of an industrial concern. Not at all.
Victor, that conversation will definitely continue, and as we continue to talk about the issues in the power sector. But thank you so much for coming on the program this morning.
Thank you.
Business Morning is back after now. Stay with us.